Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really glad to see so many faces, and I'm excited. I'm excited for the spring weather here in Connecticut, and maybe it will only last a day, but it's nice to have that day. I know some of you got friends at Carolina Meadows in North Carolina. I got some friends out in California. I got some friends in Utah. I got some friends in Goshen Ward here in Connecticut. It's nice to have this broadcast out to so many people. So it's good to see everybody. We're going to start. I'm going to call on Elise Harney because she just started us out here today with some really interesting perspective on this book and on what we know of Mr. Putin today, and also what we hear from the book. So Elise, would you mind just repeating what you said a moment ago? I think you're muted there, Elise. I'm sorry.
Am I okay now?
Yes, now you're okay.
All right. On page 168, 169 in our book that we're reading, it's talking about the war in Chechnya, which Putin started and which Putin thought the same thing. It would be a quick over with. But anyhow, its Russian forces surrounded the city of Grozny. Thousands of civilians remain trapped inside, cowering in basements with no electricity, heat, or running water. You know, the same thing we have seen now going on. And the, I guess one of the Chechnyan rebels that they quoted said, even if the war lasts 10 years, Russia will not manage to subjugate Chechnya and its people. And I think, you know, that's the same spirit the Ukrainians have, but they were also claiming war crimes, the same things that we're doing right now. It's exactly the same situation. And I mean, to think that this can all happen again is unbelievable, but I'm so glad I'm reading the book and have the history on it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I feel the same way. I think one of the things that as we make our way through the next few chapters of the book, we're going to recognize there will be some speeches that Putin gives in 2003, 2004 that are covered in the book that are really just the clear telegraphing of what he is thinking about right now. I get asked the question quite a bit, and certainly did got the question quite a bit a month ago, 2 months ago. Is he off his rocker? Is he mad? And I would have to say the answer is a definite no, unless he's sustained that madness over 20 plus years. I think what we're looking at is a plan that he hadn't been able to put into some kind of fruition until now, but he's been talking about it for a very long time and executing it, as you pointed out, at least in some other places. We've seen his behavior in, certainly we've seen it in Chechnya. We've seen it in Georgia. We'll talk about that when we get to that war in a few weeks. We've seen it in Ukraine itself, in Crimea. We've seen it in Syria. And now, of course, we're watching it almost live every day. And this is a remarkable feature, I think, of a book like this. By the way, the book was written back in 2015. So though Stephen Lee Myers is still reporting for the New York Times, he's still he is still writing about what's happening in Ukraine. This is a book that he couldn't have known unless he believed the telegraphing speeches the way they were written, that this was going to happen right now. So I think what we're enjoying is a perspective that does not include this particular war and allows us to see what Putin was up to without even understanding this particular lens. I think that's helpful. Let me stop there for a minute, see if anybody has any other comments about what I said, or at least, please, John, go ahead.
On page 173, when he's speaking to the troops, this is not just about restoring Russia's honor and dignity, it's about putting an end to the breakup of the Russian Federation. And here we are 20 years later, he's doing the same thing, saying the same stuff.
Yep. I think it's worth noting Chechnya was in the 1990s was striving to be an independent republic. It did not want to be part of the Russian Federated Republic. There are several small, mostly Muslim enclaves down in southern Russia. These are all places north of the Caucasus Mountains, so north of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. also quite mountainous and mostly Muslim populations, as I say. They were, especially in 1992, 1993, they were looking to break away altogether. They didn't want to belong to Russia anymore. Russia had control of them really since the beginning of the 19th century. There was fighting in that area even earlier, but beginning in the 1820s, 1830s, they were really pretty firmly part of the Russian Empire, but not happily. And so we saw considerable, I would say, war activity, but also terrorist activity down in that part of the world. It's worth noting that the two Boston Marathon bombers, the Tsarnaev brothers, they were from Dagestan. Their families were from Dagestan, and the older brother, the one who was killed on the night of the police chase after the Boston Marathon bombings, spent some time in Dagestan before coming back to the United States and fulfilling that plan. So this has been a complex and often violent part of the world. And what we're seeing in the particular case of the late 1990s, and I want to back up a little bit and talk about the mid 1990s for a minute, but then focus on that very important year, 1999. We're seeing just the same kind of brutality and same kind of aggression out of Putin that we're seeing today. Again, let me stop and see if anybody has any comments or any questions.
Well, I'm wondering why now? I mean, what prompted Putin to suddenly, well, it's not sudden, we know that, but what is it that tipped him into this action? I'm wondering if it has anything to do with the fact that Trump was no longer in office, but since it's clear that he has been having this on his mind for a long time, what tipped the balance? Any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a whole complicated soup of stuff. I think primarily, though, Putin is always paying attention to his own popularity within Russia. We're going to look at a chart today that has to do, in fact, maybe let me pull it up right now, because I think it's an interesting way of thinking about what it is that Putin is up to. His approval ratings, for better or for worse, and right now they're very much for the better, have been an obsession of his for a long time. We read about that a little bit last night. In that first election that he had to worry about in 2000. We'll talk about the transition from Boris Yeltsin to him. But let me just show you this particular chart, because I think it's instructive in terms of thinking about what he's doing and why he's doing it. I don't mean to disregard other things that are going on in the world. I think COVID mattered. I think he thought that the United States and that all of Europe was our focus was elsewhere, and that this would be as good a time as any to move forward. I also think the map that we looked at right at the end of class the other day, this ongoing concern about the expansion of NATO and would Ukraine be included in that? I think his own desire to get this done. He's 69 years old, and I think whatever is true, I think he had a very strange last couple of years with COVID. We see that in those bizarre meetings that he has with his advisors or with people who are visiting, sitting at that extraordinarily long table where he won't let anybody quite literally within about 20 feet of him. I think something is going on there that's worth paying attention to. But I want to look right now at this graph that I just find, first of all, I think I've said this before in this group, I can't really imagine what the job of pollster in Russia is like. That just is not a job I think I'd ever want to have. And I don't think I'd want to agree to do a poll in Russia. It's not a particularly safe place to tell somebody that you don't know on the phone what you think about things. But let's look at this. This starts back in August of 1999. So this is when he becomes prime minister. We see this very, very, very fast uptick from August of 1999, where he has 31% approval. He's the prime minister. Boris Yeltsin is still president. Yeltsin has had 3 prime ministers in 1999. This is like a revolving door. It's very hard for anybody to get any kind of traction politically in Russia at this point. And most people did not know, the vast majority of people had no idea who Vladimir Putin was really when he became prime minister in 1999. He had been the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. I think we'd all be hard pressed to name the deputy mayor of New York City right now, for example. I don't think it was a particularly household name kind of job. The other job he had was as the director of the FSB. That probably was the security forces inside Russia. The former KGB had been renamed the FSB, and he was the head of that. Probably a little more name recognition there, but still very, very low. 46 years old, never been elected to anything, and now suddenly he's the prime minister. But look at the shoot up to, by January 2000, when he is president, his approval rating is now up to 84%. Now, as we'll talk about in today and next week, Russian media, particularly Russian television, is more and more controlled by the Kremlin. There's no real ability for anybody to run a negative ad on Vladimir Putin, for example. That just doesn't happen in Russian politics. So it isn't a great surprise to see a brand new president getting quite a bit of support from the people. It dims a little bit. We see I'm sorry, this box keeps poking up as I move this. I'll try not to move it. We see that by 2004, his approval ratings are down below 70%. This is a little bit shaky for him. And we see his reelection. We see the 2008 war with Georgia. That's the next peak high. We're back up to about 80% approval ratings. But then look at that slow and kind of ugly decline. For an American politician, these numbers would be fantastic. If Joe Biden's approval ratings were 58% or 60%, he would be thrilled. For Vladimir Putin, these are bad numbers, and he's nervous about what it means as he moves forward politically. So we see that enormous jump in his approval in 2014. That is the annexation of Crimea, this nationalist move, this decision to take back what was rightfully Russia's, according to him. And we see this big tick up. But then look at what's happening, and that lasted through 2018 when he was reelected president. But then we see some not so great years. There's economic difficulty. These are primarily functions of the sanctions that came after the annexation of Crimea, and then COVID. COVID hurt him politically. The economy wasn't great. The situation in the country wasn't great. Lots of people were dying. Look at what's happened in this last month or so. This is a March 2022 poll. So we're seeing the invasion of Ukraine here playing itself out on the very end of this graph. 83% approval inside Russia. Now, we could talk about that for a long time today, but I do think that ultimately, to come back to your question, Sarah, what's driving him to do it now? This chart, I believe, is what's driving him to do it now. Lots of other reasons in the world for the timing not to be bad for him, but this is his primary concern. Let me stop there for a second. Any questions, any comments?
Where's Chechnya today? Is it controlled by Russia or completely?
Completely. He installed a president of the Chechen. I'm sorry, I'm not as up to speed as I should be on the language around that particular area and what they call it, but let's call it the Chechen region. He installed a governor of that territory that is loyal to him and is a brutal, hardline dictator of his own area. He is Chechen himself, and he controls it fiercely. And so Chechnya is very quiet, I would say, right now. There's not a lot that we hear about them, except that he's got it very much under control. The bombing was outrageous. The initial, in 1993 and 1994, the Russians fought a war without taking particularly brutal tactics. They were kind of trying to solve the problem of Chechen terrorism and separatism without coming at them as hard as they did in 1999. In 1999, they were dropping bombs at something like 5 times the rate that NATO forces used against in the Bosnia. Thank you. In the war with against Bosnia with Kosovo, trying to protect Kosovo back in the late 1990 and 1998. So we're seeing we saw just a real uptick, a really outrageous level of carpet bombing, I think is the only fair thing to call it, of the city of Grozny. By the end of it, as I think we read in the book, no stone left unturned, no building left unblemished. It was just an absolute and total assault on the city. Get the picture of the city of Stalingrad in the Second World War, similar kind of just total war. Let me stop. Sharon, you have your hand up.
Well, earlier in this class, you mentioned that Chechnya, I guess 10, 12 years ago, said they would never relent. They would not give up their autonomy or independence. And obviously that dissipated, which makes me fearful for Ukraine.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I agree that it is a sad notion that they can be, that they ultimately would give in. I'm not sure that I'm pretty confident there are still Chechens and Dagestanis out there who are if they get the opportunity, they will fight back. This is as they see it, sort of a 200-year anti-colonial war that they're fighting. But Putin has effectively closed out their ability to arm themselves and to fight. Ukraine strikes me as different. I think, first of all, it's a much, much bigger place. It has its own, it has been an independent country over the course of the last 30 years. I think it has retained a sense and also the support of the world community to declare itself and keep itself independent of Russia. Chechnya didn't have that. The world looked the other way, I'm sorry to say, when Chechnya was facing the worst of what was happening. Nobody wanted to get involved. It was seen as a dispute that everybody acknowledged was happening within the borders of Russia. There was no question, even though the Chechens didn't see it this way, the rest of the world did see that Chechnya was within Russia's borders, and nobody was stepping up to help. So I think I'm optimistic about for Ukraine in that respect, that I think they've got much more support and also much more sense of their own nationhood. Go ahead, Natalia, please.
Yes, hi, Keith, I want to return to your chart that you showed, that approval rating right now is 83%. I just want to say, from information from Russia, so the people are completely lacking the information, the true information, what is going on. The television is controlled by Putin, and basically he is the only one on the TV who is keep telling people that their what's called special operation is going according to plan. So nobody knows what the plan is, but it's going according to plan. The atrocities are not shown, and so kind of people just don't know. So I don't want to just people are supporting him because we don't know that they are. And then also the other agencies or New York Times and BBC, everyone due to sanctions actually withdrew from the region. So there is no alternative press there. And in terms of internet, also not everyone has access to the internet, and some of the internet providers like YouTube, I mean, Facebook, Twitter, they're all out. So just people don't have the information. So, but whatever they are getting information from state-controlled media, I guess they're supporting them. But I just want to say that's the
Thank you. Yeah, I very much appreciate that. I don't mean to imply by any means that the Russians are supportive, that Russians by and large are supportive of this war as we understand it. I think they are supportive of their country, of the nonsense that they're being fed about Nazis in Ukraine and all these horrible crimes that some Ukrainians are said to have committed, and therefore the Russians have no choice but to go in and protect themselves and to protect the Ukrainian people. That's an ugly irony right there. But I think there is a level of political support for Putin right now that has not been seen in a couple of years. I don't think that that's, I don't believe that they're acting, that any of this is happening in good faith. I think Putin is lying to them. And I think a lot of Russians don't have any other information except to believe him. He remains, it's interesting. One always has to think about how do countries end up with the leaders that they get. And there is something about him that remains attractive to a percentage of the Russian people. They see something, he's efficient, he's competent, he's smart, he's sometimes very bold in his kind of international aggression and international statements. And that is attractive to a percentage of the Russian population. So I think we have to acknowledge that. I mean, in the same way that I think we have to acknowledge, however you might feel about Donald Trump, he tapped into something in the United States, something politically here in the United States that some people were waiting for a very long time. And so I think we have to recognize, I'm going to come back in a minute to talk about the 1990s and politics, because I think we have to understand where this ultimately came from. But is it Kevin?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Just a comment as far as why now. There's a brilliant military historian, Victor Davis Hanson, who I follow pretty closely, and he analyzed the last 20 years of Putin's behavior. And he says it's very, very simple. It's all due to the price of oil. When oil is low, Putin's quiet. When oil's high, his coffers are full and he gets adventurous. And maybe that's oversimplified, but the guy's brilliant, and I take what he says.
I don't think it's oversimplified at all. In fact, it's another chart that I want to share with you. And I was going to do it a little later, but it seems like as good a time as any. So let's take a look at crude oil prices over the course of the last 70 years. I think this is a really, really important, if there's anything that really tells us about Russia and Russia's considerations for its foreign policy and so on, this chart is highly significant. So just to give you some bearing here, the bottom of the chart, we're looking at years. This goes all the way back to just at the end of the Second World War. We see it make its way. These are global oil prices. I don't know. So West Texas Intermediate. So that's one of the bellwether oil barrel price.
Well, that's the domestic chart for domestic oil. Brent, which is the worldwide, usually sells at a slight premium of 2, 3, 5% sometime, a little more.
Great, thank you. That helps a lot to understanding this. So what we're looking at, I think all of us know this history, that certainly in the 1960s and 1970s, we saw low oil prices, and then we had those two major jarring moments, especially 1973, the Arab oil embargo, and then ultimately the development of OPEC and its role in pricing. And we see this absolutely enormous spike very quick spike between 1973 and 1980, where the price of oil tripled, quadrupled even. And we all felt that. If you were in this country in 1979, you knew about gas lines and you knew about gas shortages and all of that. It seemed as if it would go on forever. It would just go up, 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 up. And then we see that actually in the 1980s, we had a very different experience. And the price of oil dropped by 1986 from over $130 per barrel to $27 per barrel. We had an oil glut. This was happening all over the world, not just in the United States. And we see that actually this interesting period here between 1986 and 1990, 91, this is the Gorbachev era. So the price of oil had really cratered. That affected Russia a great deal. Now it was spiking back up. This is the demise of the Soviet Union, where the price of oil is about $40 per barrel. We saw some wickedly low prices at the time of the Russian default, and also there were a number of serious economic issues happening in Asia in 1998. We saw the price of oil go below $20 a barrel. That's quite hard to imagine. I think it closed yesterday at over $100 per barrel. This seemed like a terrible crushing blow, especially to Russia, which is one of the world's largest producers of oil. So all of this comes back to Kevin's point, important point, that the price of oil has an awful lot to do with what's happening in Russia. Here we see, I don't know if you can see this as the way I'm looking at it on my screen, but Putin's first year in office, the price of oil started to go back up from below 20 to above 50. There was a little blip here, as we see, especially after 9/11. We saw a crippling of the oil markets again, but then this enormous spike over the course of the next 7 years to the heights. I think the very peak was in 2007, where oil actually was the highest it's ever been, over $150 per barrel. So over the course of just 6 or 7 years, and these were the first 6 or 7 years that Vladimir Putin was president of Russia, we see the price of oil go from 40 to 140. It was a really flush time for Russia. We read last night that it's the growth rates in Russia were 6-7% GDP per year. A lot of that comes from this oil control. Russia. The other thing that we're going to read about for next week is Russia beginning to, the Kremlin beginning to take over private oil companies and pull them into its sphere, total sphere of influence. The money that the major oil companies in Russia were making were directly benefiting the Russian government. That doesn't mean they were directly benefiting the Russian people, unfortunately. I think this is where we see corruption hit its real peak. Hundreds of billions of dollars are coming in, and they're lining the pockets of some already pretty wealthy people. Notice what happens while we're on this chart. Notice what happens here, of course, at the peak of the COVID shutdown. The price of oil demand shriveled up because the world shut down. Price of oil dropped to $20 a barrel again. That's incredible.
It actually dropped to zero, below zero on one day.
That's right. There was a bizarre day or a couple of days where things just totally bottomed out. Now we're seeing it rise again. And of course, this chart doesn't take us, it does take us to March 2022. We saw a brief spike all the way up to $130 per barrel when the invasion first happened, but it has settled back down as for lots of reasons, including more supply. But we're still seeing inflated numbers. These are for the price of oil. This has been a pretty good month if you're working for ExxonMobil or one of these companies. Again, let me stop there for a second. Any comments or thoughts about that?
There's one other thing to remember about Russian oil production. Before, let's say 1990 something, Russia's production of oil was actually below 5 million barrels because they didn't have the technology. And only when they began to become integrated into the global economic picture and got the advantage of the Western technology, and they're reputed to be able to produce 10 million barrels a day. A lot of that is attributable to the use of Western technology. And all of the service companies, and I'm sure it's going to have an effect on the Russians, have all withdrawn from Russia. So I think over some period of time, their production capacity, never mind the particular demand for their oil, which is going down, but also their production capacity is going to be impacted by the lack of Western technology, which was very important to them getting to 10 million barrels a day.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. These are all excellent points and really important to think about this is Russia's lifeline. I think I mentioned this last week. We think about the attitude of the rest of the world. I talked about the UN vote to reprimand or to condemn, I think was the language, Russia for human rights abuses after what the world discovered in Bucha last week. And the vote there was 11-3. Russia vetoed the vote, so it's an irrelevant vote anyway. They have a veto power at the United Nations, but the Security Council voted 11-3 to condemn Russia. The three were the United Arab Emirates, China, and India. And here we've got China and India representing more than 2 billion people in the world, huge markets, enormous markets. And they are not yet ready, we'll see what happens, but not yet ready to condemn Russia for its behavior in Ukraine. That matters a lot. Those are huge markets for Russian oil, natural gas, coal. Russia's resources are enormous, as I think correctly pointed out, that these are, they did not have the technology or the know-how necessarily to get at it for a number of years. Now they're much better at that, even with the services from the West leaving. They have lots of, they certainly have much more understanding of how to do these things themselves than they used to. I want to take us back, as I've been promising. I want to take us back to the 1990s for a minute, because I want to talk about the end of Boris Yeltsin, the beginning of Vladimir Putin. As Yeltsin himself says, this will be the era of Putin. And boy, was he right. Boris Yeltsin wasn't right about too many things, I'll say, but he was right about this. And I want to show you just where things were, politically speaking, in Russia in the 1990s. The idea of an election, a real election in Russia, was not something that most people living in Russia in the early 1990s had any experience with at all. The elections that took place in the Soviet Union, there was only one party permitted until Mikhail Gorbachev changed that in early 1990. But for most elections, there was only one party, the Communist Party. There was only one candidate, the Communist Party's candidate. Everybody was obliged to vote. It was a requirement to go and vote. And so candidates would win elections with 99.78% of the vote. Whatever happened to those other 0.22%, hard to know, but there was only one way to vote. What we're looking at right here is the 1996 presidential election, the first real election, I would say, in Russia, a fully competitive field of lots of different candidates. It's interesting to note that in this pile of people who ultimately lost to Boris Yeltsin, there's some well-known names here. We see Alexander Lebed finishing third in the initial vote. He was a general. We read a little bit from him last night. Gennady Zyuganov was the Communist Party candidate. This was a real threat to Yeltsin in 1996. Would the Communist Party be able to put together and win a democratically elected campaign, and they came reasonably close. There's a runoff system, not unlike what we're seeing in France right now, but the initial vote, the first round vote in June of 1996, we see that Boris Yeltsin received 35% of the vote, Gennady Zyuganov 32% of the vote. So reasonably close. In the end, it wasn't so close. The second round in July, Yeltsin wins it fairly handily, but he had to get out there and really campaign to make that work. It's worth noting that Yeltsin was not a healthy man. He'd had something like 4 or 5 heart attacks during the 1996 presidential campaign. He was a heavy drinker. We're going to look at a couple of just quick video clips of him in a moment and take note of that. Another fifth on the list here, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, received almost 6% of the vote. Zhirinovsky is about as close to a full-on kook as you can have in politics. He just died a week ago, 2 weeks ago, but he very, very outlandish political figure, difficult, I think, on every level. At one point, when he was serving in the Duma, punched another Duma member in the face during a debate. Just something of a political clown, but also somebody who was getting 4 million votes in this first round. It's worth noting one more name on this list. 6 other candidates. If you see that 6th place in the original vote, Mikhail Gorbachev was one of those people. He ran in 1996 for president. He got almost no support at all, but was lumped in with a bunch of other candidates as another candidate. Yeltsin won. This was important for all kinds of reasons, including just a sense of stability and a sense of moving forward in Russia. It seemed as though there was some possibility here for a reasonable democratic country establishing itself. And by most accounts, it was a reasonably fair vote. I think we don't see the kind of voting abuses that we'll get later, especially when Putin is a candidate, not so much in 2000, but later. I want to look, because they're available to us here, I just want to look at the 2000 numbers. We read about this last night. There was because Boris Yeltsin resigned on New Year's Eve, 1999, they had a special election in March of 2000. They had to have a special election 90 days after the resignation of the president by constitution. So instead of holding the vote in June, they held the vote in March. Vladimir Putin at that point was the incumbent, and he used that incumbency to win. He won outright. If any single candidate received more than 50% of the vote, then the election was over. There would be no runoff. It's worth noting that there's Gennady Zyuganov again, Communist Party member, finishing second. In fact, it's a lot of the same names. Yavlinsky finishing third, Zhirinovsky again finishing fifth. But the numbers are much more clear at this point. There is not much of it wasn't much of a contest. This is a blowout, really, in terms of presidential election. I've got one more to show you since we're here. Here is Putin's re-election in 2004. This is a crush. 71% of the vote went to Putin and only 14% to the Communist Party candidate. Lots of the names have changed. He had sort of by this point in 2004, kind of washed out a lot of these people that would give him a legitimate run for his electoral money. And the election was in effect over long before it happened. That there was no question that he was going to win it and win in a landslide. So again, let me stop there for a minute and see if anybody has any comments. I think it's worth thinking about. So that going back to 1996, Yeltsin won the election. He was fragile, it was not a resounding victory by any means. He had the support of the United States. He had the support of people like Bill Clinton. They had actually become pretty good friends. But he went through largely, I think, to insulate himself and also to distract the political world from coming out against him, he started this revolving door that I described of prime ministers. He had many over the course of that 1996 to 1999 term in office. In 1999, we see in particular, we have three prime ministers in the same year. He's tossing people, if they're not going to protect him and his family enough, then they had to go, and ultimately lands on Putin, who also, as I said, very low name recognition, really not much of a character that anybody thought about or cared very much about. He himself didn't seem to believe that he was the guy for the job, as we read in the book. 233 votes in the Duma to confirm him. That was 7 votes above the minimum. This is a guy getting through just barely, even though some of the prime ministers that have preceded him, including his immediate predecessor, getting considerably more votes from the Duma in what I think everybody would regard as a pretty fishy political time period in Russia. So it's not as though Putin was some kind of rising star that, I think about whatever else we want to say about Barack Obama. He was elected to the US Senate in 2006 and then the US presidency in 2008. That's a sparkling and meteoric rise by a popular politician. We're not talking about that with Putin. Putin's being named to something most people are wary of him or ignorant of him. And then ultimately, he's kind of just skating through. But we've got this war in Chechnya, and he is in charge of it. And it is something that he is not going to let Yeltsin down. I want to talk about these apartment building bombs, because I think this is one of the great mysteries of what happened in the late 1990s and in this Chechen war. Did Russia and did the Putin-led government, at this point, he was much more, I would say, in charge of the day-to-day work of the government that Boris Yeltsin was. Did they blow up their own buildings in order to create a pretext for this gruesome war that they were going to fight in Chechnya? The Masha Gessen, who wrote a book called The Man Without a Face about Vladimir Putin, and writes for the New Yorker magazine, and is very highly critical of Vladimir Putin, maintains that this is what happened, that the Russian government planted bombs in its own apartment buildings in Moscow and in other cities near Moscow, and blew them up in order to ultimately, in order to make the argument that it was Chechen terrorists who were doing it, and that they had to take out those Chechen terrorists at all costs. September 9th, September 13th, and then ultimately September 22nd. September 9th and September 13th were the 2 major apartment building explosions in the city of Moscow. Moscow is by far the largest city in Russia, and this would have been an extremely big deal. Imagine building explosions in New York City, for example. This would be a front page news item in every conceivable way. 94 people killed in the first explosion, 118 killed in the second explosion. The bombs went off early in the morning, very early in the morning, before people were up and out of bed. So it seemed to have increased even more the number of deaths possible there. There is this mysterious next bombing in the city of Ryazan, which is not very far away from Moscow, a bombing that didn't happen on September 22nd, so not too long after those first 2, where everybody was pretty skittish at this point about anything going on with buildings. There was a woman who called in to the local police a concern because there were people, in particular a woman, near one of the near a basement of a building, and she called it in to the local authorities. Local authorities came, found a bomb in the in the basement, an actual bomb in the basement of this building, and arrested the 3 people that were there who are not Chechens, but instead Russians with some connection to the FSB, the former KGB. What does this all mean? Does this mean that all of these were some sort of concocted story? I think this will probably go down for a long time in history as an unknowable, difficult thing to understand or know. Sometimes when I read these things and hear them, I think about the conspiracy theories of 9/11 and some of the wild things that came out of that post 9/11 world where it wasn't terrorists at all, but the US government was doing this or that. And then sometimes I read it and I think, nope, this sounds pretty convincing actually. So I don't know where I sit on this personally, but if it's true, and if the Russian government was orchestrating this ultimately in order to prosecute a war, a brutal war against the Chechen people, well, that's really something to consider. And if it happened that way, Vladimir Putin was certainly involved. And that's just another thing worth thinking about. The war in Chechnya made all the difference for him politically. He went from 2% polling to 40% polling by November. The war was going, from the Russian perspective, going very well. And the idea that there would be any kind of weakness in Putin, I think, disappeared pretty quickly. We get into that very strange end of December month in this reading where Yeltsin knew that he was going to step aside. The conversation with Putin, we have to take Boris Yeltsin's word for it. They were the only 2 in the room. Yeltsin did write about this himself, and he did grant interviews on this subject. But Putin, as far as I know, never has. And what we've got is Yeltsin saying to Putin, basically, you've got to take over. I have to step down. They, without question, made some sort of deal to protect Yeltsin from any prosecution for corruption or anything else that he might have done wrong. And if we believe Boris Yeltsin at this point, Putin seemed quite reluctant to take on the job. He didn't feel ready. He felt as though he didn't want to run for president. As he says, he didn't like campaigns. He didn't like anything about them, didn't want to be involved in that, but understood and agreed ultimately that the right thing for Russia and the right thing for Yeltsin, and therefore the right thing for him, was to follow through and take this job. The very first class of this that we've done on this book, I showed you Putin's speech on January 1st, the New Year's speech, his first speech as president of the country. I want to show you now a short video of his inauguration. This is not during his temporary presidency from January to March of 2000, when he was the acting president because the president had resigned. But instead, after winning the election in March of 2000, he was inaugurated officially in the Kremlin in May of 2000. And we read about this a little bit last night. I think it's hard to imagine just how extraordinary the buildings inside the Kremlin are. These are Tsarist built palaces, and we're going to see one right now. This is a palace built in Nicholas I's time in Russia. He was Tsar from 1825 to 1855. And if you've ever seen more gold somewhere, I'd like to know where that is. This is going to be quite something, I think. Give me one moment, I'll get it up on the screen. In the meantime, if anybody has any comments or questions, I'd love to hear them. I'm going to try my best. I did this successfully before class. I think I have the subtitles set for English. If they come up in Russian, forgive me, give me a second and I'll fix that. But I think I've got it. This is about a 4-minute long video. relatively little speaking. Actually, the speaking is going to come at the end of the video when we see him actually inaugurated. But I want to look at the sort of trappings of power that Putin wants the world to see. He wants us to see the Kremlin. He wants us to see his arrival and his solitary arrival. We're going to see a long passage of him walking down these glorious hallways with soldiers lining either side of the hallway, and he's walking by himself. Unlike the US inauguration or other inaugurations around the world, we don't see him walking with his wife. We don't see him walking with advisors or a vice president. It's him, and it's him alone. He's arriving alone. He's walking the stairs alone, and he's ultimately going to take the oath of office alone. His hand, by the way, is on the Russian Constitution. It's not on a Bible. And there's nobody holding that for him. It's just on a table next to him. So let's watch this and see how that goes. Here is the Kremlin. You can see the towers of the Kremlin itself, and then we'll be on a car ride in.
Носится государственный флаг Российской Федерации и штандарт президента Российской Федерации.
Прошу вас принести присягу народу России.
Клянусь при осуществлении полномочий президента Российской Федерации уважать и охранять права и свободы человека и гражданина.
Мы должны строить новую Россию. Для этого идет молодое поколение государственных людей, политиков, твердо приверженных ценностям демократии. Мы будем легче, им будет легче. Они гораздо меньше, чем мы, скованы привычками прошлого. Дело времени и напряженной работы.
Впервые за всю историю нашего государства, за всю российскую историю впервые верховная власть в стране передается самым демократическим, самым простым образом, по воле народа, законно и мирно.
Okay, I'm going to stop that there. Any comments, any thoughts about Mr. Putin?
Yeah, I was looking for that earlier today and I didn't find it, but instead found the one from, I think it's 2004. And it's interesting to compare them because he's far more confident in his stride, and the camera follows him all the way down that long hall forever and ever and ever and ever. It's an amazing hallway. But he's even almost smiling sometimes as he's nodding to people. And so his whole body language is much different from this one. So it was interesting to see.
There's one thing.
I don't think he smiled at all in this one.
Yeah.
No,
You can always believe the words of politicians. They'll follow through on them. Wonderful words from Mr. Putin. Yes.
It's when you look at it in relief, against what's happening right now, it's just startling that those words, those particular words of democratic transfer of power, the rights of man, peaceful existence in the world. It's an obscenity, really. He has that remarkable. We saw it in there. There's a glimmer of it when Yeltsin's speaking, and he looks annoyed. He looks peevish. He must really enjoy controlling things. Yeltsin, meanwhile, looked certainly better by May of 2000 than he did as president, even as in December 1999. If you watch his final speech to the Russian people on December 31st of 1999, he looks terrible, absolutely terrible. And here in this, he looks more healthy. He would die just a few years later, but I think certainly lived a hard life and pushed himself. I want to show you one more video clip today, this time because one of the important things that we have to get onto and think about as we continue this story, and we're going to get lots of it in the next reading, Putin is not only taking over, of course, control of Russia as a country and Russians, but also this highly significant role on the world stage as a leader of one of the major nuclear superpowers of the world. And so I found a clip of Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush meeting for the first time, meeting in the summer of 2001. So this is an interesting brief clip where I'm going to start it about halfway through, and we're just going to watch a couple of minutes of it. We're going to hear George W. Bush speaking briefly, and then we're going to hear Putin speaking. And again, I'll try. I think I got it right with the subtitles, but if I get it wrong, give me a moment, I'll fix it. It's interesting to think about both men at this particular point in their presidencies. Putin had been president actually longer than Bush at this point, president of Russia longer than Bush had been president of the United States. This is before 9/11, so this is really quite early, before what I would say is George W. Bush's defining moment in his presidency, or turning point moment that would change his presidency. So we're seeing them both before that happened and how they interact with each other. I think it's worth noting a couple of things just in there, again, thinking about body language. Vladimir Putin's quite short. I think most of us don't think about it that way because we see him appearing quite strong. I think he is pretty careful to surround himself by people that are not particularly tall. Dmitry Medvedev is quite a bit shorter than Vladimir Putin, which I think he must be only about 5'3", because I think Putin is only about 5'7", 5'8". Not that that's a bad thing in any way, but it's just interesting, especially when we think about American politics, where our candidates tend to be quite tall people and rather physically robust. Not that Putin's not robust, he is that. But let me get this on the screen and we can watch it.
we have a unique opportunity to address the true threats of the 21st century together. We have a great moment during our tenures.
I apologize. I don't have any idea what's going on with these subtitles here. I hope they're helpful when we turn to Putin. I don't know why they are coming up the way they are for Bush, but we can all understand Bush, of course.
To cast aside the suspicions and doubts that used to plague our nations. And I'm committed to do so. I said in Poland, I'll say it again, Russia is not the enemy of the United States. As a matter of fact, after our meeting today, I'm convinced it can be a strong partner and friend, more so than people could imagine. I offered something, logic, and a hope. Our relationship is larger than just security relationships. It's bigger than figuring out how to deal with the ABM treaty. It's much bigger than that. It deals with two leaders who share values.
Mr. Arshad Mohammed of Reuters.
Что касается проблемы противоракетной обороны. Официальная позиция России известна. Я не думаю, что нужно тратить время для того, чтобы еще раз ее здесь озвучивать. Мы полагаем, что договор противоракетной обороны 1972 года является краеугольным камнем современной архитектуры международной безопасности. Мы исходим из того, что есть элементы, которые нас объединяют с нашими партнерами в Соединенных Штатах, на что мы должны обращать внимание. Это, учитывая, что Соединенные Штаты и Российская Федерация, как никто другой, как никакая другая страна мира, много накопили ядерного оружия, оружия массового уничтожения. Поэтому на наших странах лежит и особая ответственность за сохранение всеобщего мира, за поддержание безопасности, за строительство новой архитектуры безопасности в мире. Все это предполагает тесное двустороннее и международное сотрудничество для укрепления основ безопасности в 21 веке.
Let me stop there. And I apologize. I know I've gone a couple of minutes over here, but I hope that was interesting. And again, you know, we hear these words coming out of Putin's mouth, and then we think about what we are witnessing every day. And it's a little hard to stomach that. But I want to thank everybody, especially on a beautiful spring day. I hope you'll all get a chance to get outside a little bit. We'll keep reading. Our next reading, we're going to talk quite a bit about Putin and the how he deals with the enemies within. We're going to see some rather important moments where he establishes himself fully as the leader of Russia. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for your time and attention, and it's great to see everybody. We'll see you next week.